thank you for coming today to learn about Southeast Alaska's New Deal Totem Parks with Emily Moore. We host a lot of Alaska book presentations here, but I'm really excited about this one particularly because it has a really strong connection with the collections of the State Library Archives and Museum. The book, Proud Raven, Panting Wolf, features many photographs from the collections, the library's historical collections, and also research from the records of the Alaska Native Arts and Crafts Clearinghouse, which is held in the library's historical collections as well. So we have a really good connection with this book, and some of our staff have put together a little display out front of materials related to the Totem Park. So I hope you'll have a chance to check that out on your way out. Additionally, a part of the Proud Raven totem pole that's referred to in the title is currently on exhibit in the Alaska State Museum. And research like Emily's helped to update that interpretation when we opened the new exhibits for this building. So thanks to a partnership with KTOO, today's program is being recorded, and it will be broadcast later on 360 North and also on the web at 360north.org. So thank you to Aiden and Sam for being here to make that happen. And if you could just silence your cell phones, and when we get to questions time, if you would come up here and ask your questions into the microphone so that they get captured for the recording. And also, sometimes we have some folks listening outside and they can't hear any of the questions if we don't get it in a microphone. So please help us out with that. And it is my honor and privilege to live and work on Occoquan Ani, and I thank our hosts, the Occoquan. I hope that attending programs and reading books like this one are small steps that I can take to become a better guest on Occoquan Ani, by better understanding Tlingit art and customs, and by developing a greater awareness of colonial practices that occurred historically and continue today. So now I'd like to welcome Emily Moore. She's the author of Proud Raven, Panting Wolf, Carving Southeast Alaska's New Deal Totem Parks. She's an assistant professor of art and art history at Colorado State University, and she grew up in Ketchikan. She's currently a visiting scholar at Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, and she'll be sharing her latest research on A and B flags on Friday the 28th at noon over at SHI. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Claire. Can everyone hear me? Well, I want to thank all of you for coming out this rainy afternoon. It's always a pleasure for me to get to come back to Southeast Alaska, especially when we have weather like yesterday. I got the chance to take my kids out camping at Camping Cove and was just reminded how glorious it is. I want to echo Claire in recognizing that we are on Occoquan land, traditional lands, that I stand today on Occoquan traditional lands. And much of my talk today will be about deepening our understanding of traditional land claims on these famous tourist attractions, the New Deal Totem Parks of Southeast Alaska. I also wanted to take a moment to recognize a few people in Juneau who helped with the research of this book: Ishmael Hope and Lance Hune Twitchell, who advised me on numerous questions I had about Tlingit language and protocols; Peter Metcalf, who shared photos and his own excellent research on the Alaska Native Brotherhood; and Dick Forest, who let me invade his basement for 4 summers to read the photos and journals of his father, Lynn Forest Sr., who was the primary architect for the U.S. Forest Service behind these totem parks. I was really grateful for those primary sources in Dick Forest's basement. I also wanted to recognize my father, Craig Moore, who can't be here today. He's providing childcare for my 2 children, but he has instilled in me at a very early age a deep respect for Indigenous cultures here in Southeast Alaska, and has provided housing, cars, childcare for many years when I've been coming to Juneau. So Gunal Chish, thank you for all of you for your support. My talk this afternoon is about the totem parks built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, between the years of 1938 and 1942, so the later years of the Great Depression. And just as a kind of overview before we dive into this, I know many people in Southeast Alaska are already familiar with these totem parks, But just to be very clear, the CCC themselves built 6 totem parks, 2 right outside of Ketchikan, Saxman and Totem Bight, 3 on Prince of Wales Island, Klawock, Kasan, and Heidelberg. They also restored the Mud Shark House, or Shake's House, on Shake's Island in Wrangell, and created a totem park there. They restored totem poles at an earlier park that had been established in Sitka by Governor Brady in the early 20th century. Those poles were predominantly Haida and Tlingit poles donated by leaders from Prince of Wales Island. So that had been built in the early 20th century, but the CCC restored them in the late 1930s. 3 totem poles created anew for here in Juneau. I'll talk about that in a moment. 1 pole that had been stolen from Tongass Island and erected in Seattle, it was known as the Seattle pole, and the CCC helped actually replicate that pole for the city of Seattle. So a grand total of poles that came out of the CCC workshops were 121 poles, restored or newly created, restored, replicated, or a few newly created for these parks. It was a massive program. It employed more than 200 Tlingit and Haida Native men, $2 a day to restore many of these poles, but that was an important job during the Depression. Now, these poles, this program really had some radical changes for the nature and display of totem poles, and I think that's really important for us to keep in mind once I get into the details of the program itself. Traditionally, of course, totem poles would have stood in villages facing the beach. They would have been tied to clan houses or grave sites where their crests would have been anchored to the actual hereditary owners who had the right to display those clans and crest stories. When they were removed from villages like Haukan, that you can see up on the top slide, when they were removed for the CCC totem parks and restored and replicated, they were then erected in these new grid formats, or as I'll show, along winding paths in a kind of English picturesque tradition. They were divorced from their clan ownership, often mixed from different villages. So this was a really radical change. And another really important thing to keep in mind is that totem poles traditionally had not been preserved, right? They were allowed to decay, and when a new crest or crest story was needed, a leader who had the means to do so would commission a new pole to be put up. So preserving totem poles in these alien contexts was very strange in the 1930s. And it really when you really think about it, you have to wonder why, A, the government paid so much money to restore totem poles in the remote islands of Southeast Alaska, and B, why Tlingit and Haida people agreed to lend their crest monuments to these really strange new displays for tourists. So those are the main questions that I was trying to wrestle with in my book, and that I want to share some of my research on today. From the 1960s to the 1990s, most scholars really dismissed these totem parks as kind of inauthentic tourist attractions that were the idea of U.S. Forest Service bureaucrats with very little significance for Tlingit and Haida communities. And growing up in Ketchikan, I'd always seen how important the Saxman Totem Park was for the community of Saxman. On Prince of Wales, I knew that people were restoring poles and really celebrating those totem parks. So when I was a graduate student in art history, I began to question a lot of the literature that was just dismissing these totem parks as, insignificant. And had the opportunity to interview one of the last living CCC carvers, Claude Miju Morrison, out of Heidelberg, and some other elders whose own family members had worked for the CCC. So what I wanted to share with you today is the story that was shared with me by Tlingit and Haida elders about the significance of these parks for their own communities. And that story, which is also buttressed by Forest Service records from Record Group 95 in the National Archives. So a lot of the letters that I'll be citing today are public documents that just hadn't been read before, but they're all in the National Archives in Seattle and Maryland. Okay, so I'll skip right to why would the government spend so much money on restoring totem poles in the remote islands of Southeast Alaska between 1938 and 1942? This part of the question is actually easier to answer than why Tlingit and Haida people would lend their totem poles for the restoration program. And that's because in the interwar period, in the 1930s and up until World War II broke out in 1941, there was a real interest in the United States in creating a national inventory of a quote-unquote usable past. What was the heritage of the United States? What were the national monuments and our different folk traditions? And really prized in this period of kind of a search for a national inventory of who the United States was, were Native Americans, because they were prized in this period search as the quintessential American culture. You have to recall that, of course, this is the Great Depression. The United States is responding to this crisis by trying to remind Americans of the strength of the nation's heritage, and Native Americans really did take pride of place in that search. So I like to put up this image because it shows you the kind of national highlighting of Native American art. This is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, no less. And there was a famous exhibit in 1941 called Indian Art of the United States, which was sponsored by the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, which was a federal program started during the New Deal to educate Americans about the strength of the nation's indigenous artistic traditions. And you can see at the forefront on New York City's avenues, they had this totem pole carved by John Wallace, who was at the same time employed by the CCC in Heidelberg. He had actually carved this totem pole at the 1939 World's Fair in San Francisco under the aegis of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, and it was later brought to MoMA to be shown for this 1941 exhibit. So I really can't emphasize enough how, if you read federal documents from the 1930s and 1940s, there was a genuine interest in Native art and in kind of highlighting its importance as a quintessentially American art form, right? Yes, there's definitely some appropriation going on here. I wanted to read you, though, a quote by the director of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, if I can find it in my notes. This was Rene de Harnoncourt, who was the director of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. And in the catalog for this exhibit of Indian art of the United States, he wrote, quote, "I personally believe that the Indian artist has enough to contribute to American civilization to make it worthwhile to spend a great deal of time and effort on him. I sincerely believe that Indian art may become a powerful, fresh factor in American art." So this was the kind of support for Native art that really convinced New Deal officials to actually spend the equivalent of $50 million on the Totem Pole Restoration Program over 4 years. New Deal officials originally labeled that as the boondoggliest of boondoggles, which was a watchword for unnecessary spending during the New Deal period. So they were very nervous at first about spending the amount of money it would require to restore more than 100 19th century totem poles. But because of this kind of national zeitgeist, the Totem Pole Restoration Program did move forward. On the Native side of why Tlingit and Haida people would agree to this program, scholars have long assumed that it was simply out of economic desperation during the Great Depression, that people joined the CCC for a job and that it wasn't much else. And certainly jobs were important. When I was studying at SHI a few years ago, I came across this resolution passed by the 1936 Alaska Native Brotherhood Convention. And you can see the quote here, "Therefore be it resolved by the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood in convention assembled to ask Congress to consider a larger appropriation for the relief of destitute natives in Alaska." This was because in 1936, the CCC did not allow Native people to enroll in it. The director of the CCC, who is Charles Flory, felt that Native people were the responsibility of the federal government as long-term wards and not eligible for short-term emergency relief. So when the ANB was petitioning for relief programs to be available to Native workers, and in 1937, Congress, because of those petitions from ANB, did require that 50% of enrollees in Alaska be Native, and the Totem Pole Restoration Program started the next year. So this was really, again, I'm going to try to really emphasize Native agency throughout this talk. They fought for this. They fought to be included in the CCC. I also found letters in the National Archives from Haida resident, or Kassan resident, Raymond Jones, who actually wrote suggesting a totem pole restoration program for his community. And I wanted to read this quote to you from just one of his letters. He actually wrote several of them. This was in 1938, August 1938. Quote, "The fishing season has just come to an end. The people of this village have not earned enough to keep them through the coming winter. There's a desperate need for relief this winter. The natives of this village have never called for relief work, and thus there is a real need for it. We did not ask for a CCC camp last year because nearly all the men folks were planning to trap fox fur. The people have always depended a lot on the trapping season. This year, there will be no trapping. If there is any way that you could help us, we will appreciate it very much. Mr. Leonard Allen of Ketchikan suggested that the totems at Old Kassan be repaired. He believed that the Parks Department, which oversaw this, what at the time was a national monument at Old Kassan, would allow the Forest Service through the CCC to do the repairs. This is a good, worthwhile project, and we wish the Indian Office would look into this idea." So there were actually requests from a few Native communities to have this totem pole restoration program brought to their community and to provide jobs for Native people in that way. What was far more interesting to me, though, than the jobs front was the fact that so many elders, including Claude Miju Morrison, who I interviewed in Heidelberg, really emphasized that the Totem Pole Restoration Program under the CCC was not just about jobs. It was about a means to assert Tlingit and Haida land claims to the U.S. government, and particularly to the U.S. Forest Service, who was overseeing the CCC program in Alaska. So I know this is a lot of text, but I just wanted to give you a little context for what was going on at the time in the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood. In 1929, the ANB and ANS had voted to make Aboriginal claims to the Tongass National Forest their #1 priority. And this meant that the 17 million acres of the Tongass National Forest, which the U.S. Forest Service was administering, those 17 million acres had never been negotiated with Tlingit and Haida claimants to those lands. There had never been a settlement at the time. And in 1929, the ANB and ANS decided this was going to be the main thing they were going to work on. They were going to send William Paul to Congress to start a land claims lawsuit for a settlement for the Tongass National Forest. In 1935, President Roosevelt signs the Jurisdictional Act, allowing the Tlingit and Haida to sue for compensation for lands lost to the Tongass National Forest. So this is a huge event where the Indian New Deal under President Roosevelt is starting to recognize the fact that Native people did have legitimate claims and should receive a settlement. So the Jurisdictional Act allowed this lawsuit to move forward. In 1939, the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida Indians of Alaska was established here in Juneau as the federally recognized tribe to negotiate that settlement. And then, of course, World War II interrupts a lot of the testimony, but it picked up again in 1944. By 1959, the U.S. Court of Claims ruled that, yes, indeed, the Tlingit and Haida did deserve compensation for their lands lost, and it took until 1968 for them to agree on a price, which was only $7.5 million for 17 million acres of land in the Tongass National Forest. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that remember that the CCC Totem Pole Restoration Program occurs 1938 to 1942. It is right after the Jurisdictional Act has been passed. It is at the time that the CCC workers, the majority of whom, by the way, are also members of the Alaska Native Brotherhood. When I compared the rosters and roles, 80 to 90% of them were also A and B brothers. So it really buttressed what I was told by many elders, that this land claims lawsuit was one of the foremost priorities of Tlingit and Haida people at this time. And they were going to use these totem poles, this totem pole restoration program, as a way to channel the U.S. government's interest in their totem poles to assert some of their own cultural and political claims. So I'll get more into that in a little bit. Let me get into the kind of step-by-step process of this 4-year totem pole restoration program, and then I'll return to ways in which Tlingit and Haida leaders kind of navigated that program to assert their own sovereignty. After Congress, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and then the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, received money for the Totem Pole Restoration Program, the Forest Service could move forward with work. And the first step was to identify totem poles that were quote-unquote worthy of restoration in the Forest Service's eyes. This meant totem poles that had a great deal of beautiful carving, a lot of figures. They weren't very interested in the planar shafts, as they called them, with maybe a single crest figure at the top. So I found these old photographs at the National Archives. They're really beautiful photographs of the reconnaissance mission, basically, that the U.S. Forest Service did in 1937 and 1938, traveling around older Native villages. Of course, you all in this audience know that many Native people had been pressured to leave these villages for educational and employment opportunities in larger towns, so these totem poles had been left behind around the turn of the century. And by the late 1930s, many of them, as you can see, were very decayed. So this is a photograph from Old Kasan with the Forest Service skiff docked up there. You can see the officials deciding if this totem pole could be restored, if it was sound enough to be restored. I found some really interesting reports by particularly the district ranger based in Ketchikan. His name was C.M. Archbold. I came to felt like I really got to know this guy. He was really important in the Forest Service restoration program because he was based in Ketchikan in southern Southeast Alaska, where the majority of these 19th century totem poles stood. But you can see in his early reports, he was taking these photographs of all of these 19th century poles. Here he writes, "These two totems are the only ones in this village worthy of restoration. Tops not shown are rotten away and should be cut back to sound wood and capped with copper or galvanized metal." So he was really trying to figure out what could be saved from these totem poles, creating this whole document of poles that could be restored by the CCC. Once the Forest Service had decided on this list of priority poles, they had to work with the Office of Indian Affairs. We know it today as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, but until 1947 it was actually the OIA. So they worked with the OIA and different Native communities to identify contemporary claimants to those 19th century poles. Who were the descendants of the owners who had erected them? Regional Forester B.F. Heinzelman, who was here in Juneau, the director of all the Forest Service, wrote very clearly at the beginning of the project, do not undertake any work on these poles unless and until the Indian owners in writing agree to our doing the work and promise to retain ownership and location of the poles for at least 10 years. So he was really adamant that there be some kind of signed document between Native claimants and the Forest Service. In the Ketchikan Ranger District Office, I was really excited to find these photographs. On the back of the photographs, you can see where CM Archbold took the photos in his reconnaissance mission to identify the different poles that were worthy of restoration. He later wrote the names of the claimants that the Office of Indian Affairs helped him identify. So this particular pole was owned by William Brown. You'll see him again in a moment. He was the father of Charles Brown, who was the lead carver in Saxman. So all of these photographs had this kind of documentation. And then the Forest Service went and approached these different claimants and got them to sign these very famous Memorandum of Agreements. These are all in the National Archives. I've been trying to share as many of them as I can with family members because they have a lot of the old signatures of different Native leaders. So you can see here these Memorandum of Agreement basically spelled out 3 important changes that would take place for these totem poles. And they were signed, as you can see, by the different claimants. So the first one here says, by Andy Moses, owner of 2 inside house totems representing a wolf and 1 whale memorial. Whereas further down, you have James Andrews, claimants to the Raven Totem and to 2 inside house totems having beaver bases and to 1 other pole on the north end of Pennock Island. So they identified each pole that they were going to move, had Native claimants sign it. And I just wanted to point out the language that's up in the bulleted part of these Memorandum of Agreement. First of all, they argue we are going to preserve these poles for future generations. This is what the Forest Service and Native people agreed they wanted to do. Of course, that was not tradition, so that in itself was something that many Native communities wrestled with. And I know that, for example, at Klawock, there's a letter from I forget which Paratovich. He was the mayor of Klawock at the time, and he really said that so many elders there were not comfortable with preserving those poles. So there were definitely poles that were not signed over to the Forest Service for restoration because some people felt very strongly that they should not be preserved. The second bullet point was that the poles should be moved, that the Forest Service would be able to move part or all of the totem poles remaining on the north end of Pennock Island to a publicly owned site within the township of Saxman. The Forest Service required that each Native community, contemporary Native community that was going to host a totem park, choose a town site lot or some kind of lot that was publicly owned. These poles could not be privately owned property and be restored using taxpayer dollars in a New Deal program. So it was required that all Native claimants to the poles basically agree that from now on they would be regarded as community-owned property. And that was a very difficult thing for many people to accept as well, because of course this has always been traditionally owned by different clans. And the final point here is that all poles so restored and erected will hereafter be considered as community property of the residents of Saxman, and at no time will any such poles be disposed of by sale, gift, or otherwise. So I want to just emphasize how controversial this was, right? It was very difficult for communities to wrestle with these changes to their poles, and many people did not sign the Memorandum of Agreement. For the poles that were released to the Forest Service and the CCC for restoration, this was when the physical labor began. And I was marveling at the amount of physical labor that went on to build these parks, because not only were they moving 19th century poles from ancestral villages. You can see in this village are in this photo from Sukwon. They laid down a little ribbing of small logs to help drag the 19th century pole across it without hurting the pole too much. They would put them on scows and drag them back to the CCC carving sheds in Saxman or Kasan, Wrangell. And once they got to the CCC carving sheds, the work of deciding whether or not the pole was sound enough to be restored, or if it was so decayed that it had to be replicated. That's where it all began, in the CCC sheds. I love some of these photos of the actual CCC crews. They really varied in size. The Kasan crew was never more than about 10, whereas Saxman was one of the larger crews. It could be up to 25 men at a time. As I mentioned before, all of these men made $2 a day. If you were a leader, you could make $5.60 a day, but that money was very important during the Depression. So they worked hard. These are just more photographs that help me really kind of wrap my head around the physical labor of finding massive 19th century trees to rebuild the whale house in New Kasan. Here they are hauling timber to make shakes for the Kasan house. The process of replication was one of the most controversial processes for the Forest Service to tackle, and the CCC got a lot of criticism for the replicated poles. Many scholars said that the replicas were gross affronts to the 19th century poles that they had been intended to replicate. They just weren't as high of quality. And of course, many of the men in the CCC program had not been traditionally trained as totem pole carvers. They had grown up in a generation when totem pole carving was taboo, and that education had not been available to them because of colonial practices. So I was really interested in the ways in which the CCC carvers tried their best to replicate the pole. You can see in this photo on the right, they laid the 19th century pole right next to the replica pole and tried to transfer measurements using calipers, using tape measures. They were trying to be very exact about the actual proportions. There were lots of problems about this, though, because it was difficult to find the size of trees, the 19th century trees that had been available, or not available in the 1930s. Most of them had been logged. It was very difficult to find the traditional paint pigments. There was a wonderful passage I found about an elder in Sitka saying, well, it took 6 women 3 days to chew the fish eggs to create the binder for the Panting Wolf posts in Sitka. How do you think you're going to make paint for 121 poles in 4 years? Like, this just wasn't going to happen. So they used commercial paints, probably far more than had ever been used in the 19th century, because the emphasis was on preservation, and they wanted to shellac the entire pole with as much color as they could, again, to keep out rain and rot. The few carvers who had experience in the CCC were very elderly, and I wanted to highlight some of them. One was John Wallace, I'm sure is a familiar name to many of you. He was from Heidelberg. He's from the Schralandas lineage of the eagle moiety, and his father, his English name was Dwight Wallace. He carved the old witch pole that's here in the State Building in Juneau, and was a very famous 19th century carver from Prince of Wales Island. And he had trained John Wallace in the 1860s to become a professional carver. There's a really poignant autobiography by John Wallace where he says that his father was afraid the Haidas would lose the art of totem pole carving because he saw the impacts of colonization. And he was trying to raise his son to continue this practice. But by the time John Wallace had a family to support in the 1880s, he could not make a living as a totem pole carver. Missionaries had condemned totem poles. There's a story of John Wallace possibly burning one of his father's totem poles. in Howcan, or at least chopping it up to help make a boardwalk. So it just was not a period where John Wallace in his adult life could have continued that practice. And it wasn't until he was almost in his 80s that the CCC project came along and gave him the opportunity to practice the skills that he had acquired as a teenager. And I really see him and some of these other men, I should keep going, as kind of bridges between, these very tenuous bridges between 19th century practices and the 20th century continuation of totem pole carving. Thomas Gunasti Yuccas, who is from Wrangell, Kiksadi clan, he had also been trained by his father, Yuccas, and I know Steve Brown, who's seated in the audience here, wrote a great article on Yuccas's work. So he had also possibly learned from his father and helped pass on some of those stories. Thomas Yuccas, or some of those practices. Thomas Yuccas's granddaughter is Ethel Lund here in Juneau, and she told me that what she most remembered about her grandfather was how much he loved the CCC carving shed because it was a quote-unquote happy place, one of the few places in the 1930s where he could really celebrate Tlingit culture and pass down the stories that he knew. He loved telling them to the younger CCC workers who were in that carving shed. The one other carver I really want to highlight was a young man, Charles Brown, who's here on the right. He was Nechadi clan from Saxman, but his father, he was Tequedi Yuddy. His father was William Brown, who had been born at Tongass Village. And although I couldn't find any documentation that he was trained as a totem pole carver, he was the one who did all of the adzing on the Seattle pole that was returned to Seattle. And he also finished the governor's pole here in Juneau. So he must have had some training. I don't know the extent of it. But William Brown really learned from his father, Charles Brown, the younger man here, really learned from his father, and he was one of the most exacting carvers, I think, who he had been sent off to boarding school, but there are some wonderful stories, recordings of his work at the University of California, Berkeley, because he died in San Francisco and did all kinds of recordings in San Francisco before he died. And he said that the CCC program gave him the chance to dive back into Tlingit culture that he'd been taken away from when he went to boarding school. So I think he took it really seriously as an opportunity to learn from the 19th century poles and to try to develop skills as a carver that he hadn't been able to develop otherwise. I should just say that many of these CCC carvers were at least familiar with wood. They were professional boat builders. They were really practiced in wood, but many of them just had not had the training in Northwest Coast carving. So after these poles were restored or replicated, the next step was to actually erect them in these new totem parks. And this gets really interesting to me just to see the kind of arrangements of the parks themselves. The parks were all designed by Juneau's own Lynn Forest Sr. And some of you might know that MRV Architects is the child architectural firm of the firm that Lynn Forest began after he left the U.S. Forest Service. He had also designed Timberline Lodge in Oregon up on Mount Hood for an earlier New Deal program. So he was a really prolific architect for New Deal programs and really invested in native arts. This is a great picture that I found in Dick Forest's basement of Lynn Forest standing beside the ravens, sitting on a box of daylight. He designed this post actually for the Saxman Totem Park and had it carved there. Lynn Forest had trained briefly at MIT and later at the University of Oregon in architecture. And he studied a lot of landscape architecture as well. And when he came to Alaska right before the CCC Totem Pole program, the only totem park that was extant before he arrived was the Sitka Park, which you can see here. And that had been built in an existing park. Probably many of you know this story. Governor John Brady received these donated poles from Prince of Wales Island, and he erected them in a picturesque manner. He worked with a photographer called Elbridge Merrill out of Sitka to arrange these poles along an existing path in what is now called Indian Park. So this was an English picturesque framework for displaying totem poles. The idea of winding serpentine lines with framed views looking out onto the Bay of Sitka and these beautiful kind of, in the English picturesque tradition, you would have had monuments and ruins to kind of add to the picturesque quality. So this English garden design, of course, some of you probably know this, but it was very popular in the 17th and 18th century. It came over to Central Park in New York City. And I really believe that Lynn Forest was inspired by that Sitka model and this English picturesque model. These are some of my bad maps of the different totem parks, but he designed some parks on this kind of lineage of the English picturesque with these winding paths through these serpentine paths through the forest with framed views overlooking the bay at Kisan and at Totem Bight near Ketchikan. And then there was also a much more geometric kind of strict grid work favored in the French landscape design. Remember, all of these garden styles would have had monuments and sculpture as part of them. These were very familiar means for Euro-Americans to view sculptures in sculpture parks. So if you look at Saxman, and this is Lynn Forest's original design plan for the Saxman Totem Park from the National Archives, he even mapped out which poles he wanted from which villages, which were mainly based on the height. It's a very dramatic park if some of you have been to Saxman and you go up Totem Row, and the tallest pole, the Chief Ebbets pole there in the center, is right smack dab at the top. He paired beaver house posts on either side. It was this kind of beautiful symmetry that he was going for. We know that the Forest Service and New Deal officials were working really hard to make totem poles more than curiosities, was their phrase. So often tourists had seen these as kinds of grotesques, or they were awe-inspiring but grotesque and weird. And the New Deal was trying to reframe totem poles as dignified public monuments that were part of American heritage. So in my book, I argued that Lynn Forest and the U.S. Forest Service were turning to these very stately kinds of monument parks, sculpture garden parks, to try to help reframe totem poles in that way, even though it was such a bizarre setting for parks in many ways, for poles in many ways. Okay, the hope of all of these totem parks for New Deal officials was that they would become long-term tourist attractions and benefit Native communities. It was not just short-term relief work in the CCC that would help Native communities, but that tourists would flock to them and buy moccasins and other Native arts and crafts, model totem poles that would be for sale at the parks. That did not happen immediately, but I believe that's true today, right? The Saxman Totem Park is one of the main tourist destinations in Ketchikan and has become a really important site for the carving shed there and for a small gift shop. So I went all over Alaska and Washington trying to find tourist albums that showed the parks in the 1940s and 1950s, just to try to get a read on how did tourists enjoy going to the parks. Were they learning to appreciate totem poles as more than curiosities? There were very few journals as elaborate as this one. This is the Mauer's journal that was up at the University of Alaska Anchorage archives. And you can see they have photographs here of the brand new Saxman Park. They also went to City Park in Ketchikan. And in Wrangell, they went to the brand new Chief Shake's house that had just been rededicated. You can see their subtitle there is An Old Indian Cabin and Totem Poles at Wrangell. So there wasn't a lot of at least they didn't type a lot of their awareness of the significance of that house, but they were clearly going to see these totem parks right when they were opened. They were very interesting to tourists. There are lots of photographs in just tourist personal albums and postcards that they were collecting to have pictures of totem poles in their photo albums. But there are also a lot of photos like these that don't necessarily show a degree of respect for the poles that New Dealers were really trying to inspire. I also found at the Indian Arts and Crafts Board in Washington, D.C., an incredible collection of model totem poles that seem to have been directly inspired by the CCC parks. You can see the one here on the left is the sun raven totem, and the carver even recreated the small log sign that was at the base of the park, or of the pole in the Saxman Park. So clearly there were artists who were trying to give tourists a kind of souvenir they could take home in their suitcase from their experience in these parks. I just could not find a lot of information about how much they sold for, if this was a livelihood for many carvers. The one carver I know of who continued to carve after the CCC was George Daniel Benson in Sitka, and he's well known there because in the 1960s he really worked with the Native Artist Demonstration Program near the Sitka Totem Park, and is really credited by a lot of carvers there for teaching a younger generation carving traditions. And he himself said that it was the CCC that gave him the first opportunity to carve poles. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. I just want to return to Tlingit and Haida, the importance of these parks for Tlingit and Haida people, and how they really channeled this very strange government program into a means to assert their own cultural and political prerogatives. So I love this photograph because it's of Henry Denny Sr., who is well documented in the Tlingit and Haida land claims lawsuit that I told you about. He protested the Forest Service burning down his smokehouse on the Unic River and providing homestead grants for white homesteaders to take over his home. So he was actively protesting the U.S. Forest Service kind of practices on his homeland at the same time that he was working with the U.S. Forest Service on the CCC program. And this particular photograph shows him telling his grandchildren for a newspaper camera, as you can see. They made a newsreel of the whole totem pole project, and that newsreel is also in the National Archives. But what I want to emphasize here is that, yes, he was kind of performing for this newsreel. It was going to be a tourist site, and yet he now has this totem pole that had formerly been at Cape Fox Village, now in his contemporary community, where he can tell the crest story of that pole to his grandchildren. So this was really important for a new generation of Tlingit and Haida kids to actually hear the crest stories of their clans. There are many examples of Tlingit and Haida people adding, asking that their clan poles or even their grave markers be added to the totem parks, even if the Forest Service hadn't originally wanted them for the totem parks. But it became so important to commemorate their own ancestors and their own clan stories in the parks that they personally petitioned the Forest Service to include them. So this, if you can see the small white marble grave marker, that belonged to a Tequati man. It had been erected on his grave. And the Tequati family asked that that grave marker be brought into the totem park. It was removed from its grave, but they wanted it there beside their Tequati pole to commemorate an ancestor. To me, this was a really important example that the parks were legitimate sites for memorializing ancestors. This was another example. In Heidelberg, Adam Spoon and Charles Scott petitioned the Forest Service to have their family poles included in the new totem park. They are small poles, and it should not be such a hard task to move and repair or make copies of them. I'll just briefly say I see the CCC program as a means for repatriation. The totem pole that I mentioned to you, the Seattle pole that had been stolen from Tongass Village by Seattle businessmen and erected in Seattle in 1899, it became known as the Seattle pole. But for Tongass Tlinkits, it was the Chief of All Women pole. The CCC, as I said, ended up creating a replica of that pole for the city of Seattle because a vandal's fire had burned it and it needed to be restored. But at the same time, and I apologize for this kind of blurry photograph, but I was trying to show the comparison. Charles Brown, who you'll remember his father was from Tongass Village and remembered when that pole had been stolen, carved a new version of that pole, which is on the front of the Totem Bight, the clan house at Totem Bight. So kind of repatriated that pole and brought it back to Tontaquan lands. I'm just going to skip to the end here because we're almost out of time. What I really wanted to emphasize was the fact that many of the totem poles that were released to the Forest Service for restoration were explicit records of land claims. And in fact, this totem pole was entered in the lawsuit that was filed against the U.S. government as evidence for Tlingit and Haida property ownership of a particular stream outside of Klawock. So this is the sockeye salmon pole, which was replicated for the Klawock Totem Park. You can see at the base a kind of basket holding fish. Steve Langdon has told me this is an icht, one of the traditional means of catching fish. This was an important sockeye stream, which was owned by the crest at the top, the Bear Clan, holding this fish. And there were lots of stories documented around this pole about how the Tequati people had owned that particular, or I'm sorry, it's not Tequati, it is a Brown Bear Clan. But in any case, that they own this particular stream. And so this pole was used as evidence for the Tlingit and Haida land claims lawsuit to show this long-standing claims of Tlingit and Haida people to particular salmon streams and acreages of land. This was another example in the Klawock Totem Park with the spirit of the Hazy Island pole. The Hazy Islands had been designated by the Forest Service as a national wildlife refuge, and any gathering of muir eggs was considered stealing. That had happened previous to the CCC program. During the CCC program, the Klawock Tlinkits used government money to replicate the pole and to get the Forest Service to record their claims about the pole as having had the traditional rights to gather muir eggs on Hazy Island. So again, these were kinds of assertions to the U.S. government. Hey, you want to know the stories of our totem poles? We'd be glad to share them with you. And this is the story of that pole, right? These were our claims. I'll just finish by saying these totem parks remain really important to contemporary communities. If you go down to southern Southeast Alaska, every single one of the New Deal totem parks is being restored, has been being restored. This is the Heidelberg Totem Park in July 2009. The entire park, there are no CCC poles left now. They've all been replicated for a third time by continuing generations. And so to me, the story of the New Deal totem parks is far more complicated and rich than saying that they were just tourist attractions. These were really important sites for Tlingit and Haida communities then and today to continue cultural practices of passing down clan stories, asserting their claims to the U.S. government, and helping to teach the public like us more of the history of Tlingit and Haida land claims in Southeast Alaska. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions. Yes, there are copies of my book, and I'm happy to sign them. And I'll just say, too, that I've publicly pledged in the book to donate any royalties that come from the book back to programs that support Northwest Coast Native art. So just made a $500 donation to Southeast or Sea Alaska Heritage, and I'm really interested in supporting the Totem Heritage Center in Ketchikan as well as the Prince of Wales Island, the smaller carving sheds there. So there's a little plug. If you'd like to get a book after, it'll go to a good cause.
How long did it take you to do all your research?
I started this research in 2009, so this is a good 10 years now, and the book is finally out, and my whole family is very happy. I just remembered I'm supposed to repeat the question. Do I have plans for future work on this topic? There's still a lot more work to be done on the specific polls of the CCC, but I don't plan to do them. I think someone else should do some of the work. Yes?
You had a photo of the Lincoln pole. I've seen that before, but tell me where it is.
Yes, so the figure is the Lincoln finial, and I try not to call it the Lincoln pole anymore. The Tlingit name for it was the Proud Raven pole. It was originally from, where is it here? Oh, great. It's out in the atrium as well. There's a photo of it. Yes, that pole is very complicated. It came from Tongass Village, and the replica is now in the Saxman Totem Park. For a long time, you might be familiar with the story published by Judge Wickersham. That was the story that the pole had been carved to honor Abraham Lincoln for, here it is. Judge Wickersham in 1924 published a very influential article in Sunset magazine, and he was trying to get the U.S. government to preserve this pole. So his story in that Sunset article was that Tongass Tlinkits had erected this pole to commemorate Abraham Lincoln for the Emancipation Proclamation, which he claimed had freed Tlingit slaves and had freed the Tantaquan Tlinkits from becoming enslaved to an enemy clan. Most Tongass elders that I have talked to and the archives that were created under the U.S. Forest Service in the 1930s argue that this pole instead was to commemorate the first white man that was seen in Tongass territory, and that they used a photograph of Abraham Lincoln because it was the only prototype handily available of a white man. So the whole pole is known as Proud Raven Pole, and this figure was just the very top of it. At the base of a slender shaft was a figure of a raven, and that was, this was a Ganachati clan, raven in the Raven moiety. So the story that I was told was that a member of the Raven moiety was very proud to have seen the first white man in Tongass territory many years before, and that this pole had been erected to commemorate that important encounter. But that had nothing to do with honoring Abraham Lincoln per se. The question was about the relationship to the Seward pole, which was also erected at Tongass Island, and that pole was a shame pole, as I understand, erected to shame William Seward and the U.S. government, perhaps for failing to reciprocate a large potlatch that was thrown in Seward's honor when he visited Tongass Island in 1869, shortly after the purchase of Alaska that he helped orchestrate. And Chief Ebbets, who had hosted that potlatch, was said to have been chagrined that Seward had not reciprocated what gifts were given to him, and more contemporary understanding of that was that Seward and his clan, the United States, had never recognized Tantaquan sovereignty over their land. So this was more than just shaming for the specific potlatch, but was a larger kind of imbalance of respect and recognition of kind of official status, perhaps. So yeah, there's a lot more on all of these pools that we could learn, and I don't claim to know all of it either. But the Seward pool was a separate pool from the Proud Raven pool with this Lincoln finial. Yeah, the talk that I'm giving next week at Sea Alaska Heritage is on research that I'm just starting, and right now I'm really interested in the use of the American flag in Alaska Native Brotherhood halls. There's an interesting practice from the early 20th century where they would have a flag in the back of the room, the back of the stage, but it would be gathered up. And there's often a small image hung right where the gathering is. And in one case, I know that image was of Chief Shakes. I'm learning what the other images are, but I'm really interested in what that display practice kind of signified, why they did that, what it meant. I'm also really interested in learning more about the village of Tuxacan, which was the Tlingit village on the site Metlakatla is now, and it was a Tlingit village before Metlakatla. There's a lot of work around southern Southeast Alaska that hasn't gotten as much attention as I think it deserves, so I'm hoping to learn more about that. Thank you, everyone.